Also on the front of the Australian tomorrow, the headline reads, Ukraine war to fuel a $12 billion petrol shock. The global energy shock that has sent the price of unleaded petrol above $2.20 a litre will rip an estimated $12 billion out of Australians' hip pockets this year, dragging on the economic recovery as consumers pull back on spending elsewhere. Caro, we were speaking about this on Paul Murray last night. We were speaking about this on the front page last night, and what I feel like we've been speaking about with you here on the show for what feels like months now in regards to cost of living, which is going to be a massive election issue. Now, how do you think that the government, even though they are not responsible for this, how are they going to quell the fears of everyday Australians who are seeing $2.20 at the Bowser when they've got spiking interest rates and as well as inflation and other pressure when it comes to household items and things like that? How are they going to manage this when they're coming into an election cycle?
Well, it is a really difficult thing to manage because obviously the oil price is not something that the Australian government can set directly. There are the other sorts of mechanisms and other things that they can do which may be able to alleviate it. Now, the problem with something particularly like this, and we've spoken about this before, Jenna, is it really hits the people who can't afford it. You know, this sort of price rise, you know, people who live week to week, they feel this more than anyone else. And they are the people, you know, the quiet Australians, the everyday people who are getting on with their business that the current government, you know, really wants to keep on side, you know, coming up to an election. But what we're seeing in the Ukraine is actually, and I almost said, excuse the pun, it really is fuel to the fire because, you know, inflation has been an existing issue and it has been creeping up. And this here has just, the Ukraine crisis has just made it all worse because we're a net importer of crude oil. So that's why it becomes a national security and an economic issue and a personal everyday living issue for us here in Australia. We heard the RBA governor say this week that, you know, that we might have to go on interest rates later in the year. Do you remember, Jenna, when we were talking about interest rates not going up until 2024?
Yeah.
So talking about it later in the year. But the problem with inflation, and we've talked about this before, it's not a problem until it's a problem.
Exactly.
And if you let it become a problem, then it's really hard to wind it back and to nudge those gears without doing anything too major, which can cause other adverse consequences in the economy while you're trying to get inflation under control. The one thing that the government can do, and I'm sure there's been discussion on it, they can reduce excise if they want to.
Yeah.
That is the immediate and direct way in which the government can alleviate fuel prices ahead of the election. Don't worry about beer, worry about fuel.
Yeah. Or you could also look to the opposition to see if they're willing to pull the trigger on calling for that. It's going to be very interesting when push comes to shove over the next couple of weeks, specifically with budget only 2 weeks away.